Tanya Bogdanovich seemed to be an average working mother.
She was very attentive and very caring.
But behind her wholesome facade was a secret sexual desire.
She spent the vast majority of her time online looking for sex fantasies.
And she found just what she was looking for in an adventurous college student named Michael McGregor.
He's looking for someone with more experience, someone who can show him the ropes.
Together, the couple unleashed their passions and explored their kinkiest fantasies. But their insatiable lust would lead to a dark obsession and end with an unspeakable crime.
She's covered in blood, and she's hysterical, she's crying.
Now, go behind the scenes with those who knew the lovers and learn what caused this gruesome atrocity and unravel a twisted tale of sex, bondage, and passion gone horribly awry.
A real scary picture started to unfold.
January 1st, 2013, Ontario, Canada. While locals in the sleepy town of Sarnia had been up most of the night celebrating the new year, one concerned resident was calling local police. Lynn Paquette told officers that her daughter Noelle had gone out to a party the night before. They were supposed to see each other that day, but Noelle had never shown up and wasn't answering her phone.
Noelle was really close to her parents, particularly her mom, and would speak to her 4 or 5 times a day. And she was a big texter. So radio silence, it was unusual.
Noelle's mother told police that she'd spoken to some of her daughter's friends, who were the last ones to see her. They said Noelle had left the party after an incident with her boyfriend.
They get into a lover's spat, more than likely fueled by alcohol, and she decides, I'm leaving.
Noelle told her friend, I'm going home and I'm gonna walk there.
It was the last time anyone had spoken to her. The question now for police was what happened to Noelle Paquette after she walked alone into the night? And where was she now? The answers to those questions would ultimately lead to the unmasking of 2 desperate killers, whose obsessions pushed them to do the unthinkable. At the southern tip of Lake Huron lies the peaceful town of Sarnia, Ontario. It was also home to young Tanya Bogdanovich. Raised by a single mother, Tanya grew up into a confident, if slightly self-possessed, teenager.
She was very fun and outgoing. She didn't want to fit into any mold that anybody had, so she was pretty much herself.
But Tanya's strong will didn't set well with everyone. Tanya's parents had divorced when she was a child, and her mother eventually remarried. And Tanya's rebellious attitude as a teenager led to constant conflict with her stepfather. Tensions in the family quickly escalated out of control, to the point where 15-year-old Tanya was sent to stay at a nearby group home with other girls who were wards of the state. At first, Tanya enjoyed life away from her stepfather's discipline. But she would quickly discover her new living situation was a nightmare by comparison.
She was living with some troubled girls, and they saw her as easy prey.
Tanya was very new to the group home, and she felt like she could not fight back. She was sexually, physically, and emotionally abused.
Tanya begged her mother to let her come home, only to be turned away.
Her mother ignored it. Nothing was done. And I think that set the groundwork for a life of a lot of mistrust.
When she turned 18, Tanya was able to move out of the group home. No longer a ward of the state, Tanya was free to take control of her own life. She met a local man and got married. By her early 20s, she was the happy mother of 2 children. But once again, Tanya's trust would be betrayed.
Tanya's husband just walked out on her and her kids.
Left to raise 2 children on her own, Tanya took whatever work she could find. And after just a few years, she managed to save enough money to start a new life and a new career in nursing school.
I met Tanya originally when I was going to college. She was very attentive and very caring, and nursing was definitely something that she wanted to do for the rest of her life.
After graduation, Tanya found work as a nurse in a senior center and started dating a new man. Soon, they'd move in together. He was kind and supportive, helping Tanya raise her children.
She just wanted to be able to move forward with her life and give her kids stability and a good life.
But as much as Tanya appreciated her live-in boyfriend, their sex life left her deeply unsatisfied.
He's a traditional guy, which makes him really attractive to Tanya as a potential husband, but their sex life, it's boring.
Tanya craved a more passionate and adventurous sex life, so she went online and found a social media site that catered to people looking to explore their kinkiest sexual desires.
By day, she was the mother. She had a committed partner, and she worked as a nurse, but she spent the vast majority of her time online looking for sex fantasies, looking to share them, looking to find a partner.
And it was online that Tanya would ultimately meet the sexually adventurous partner she was looking for. An 18-year-old college student named Michael McGregor. Like Tanya, Michael had been raised in southeastern Ontario. Growing up, he didn't have many friends, preferring to spend most of his time on his computer. And when teenage hormones began to kick in, Michael's online activity found a new focus: pornography.
He starts out with regular porn sites, but the more he watches, the more he gravitates towards the kinkier stuff.
When he left home for college at 18, Michael longed to find someone who shared his desires. But the awkward freshman lacked the confidence to meet girls, let alone one who might be willing to indulge his sexual fantasies in real life.
He has thoughts he can't share with anybody, has a big hole inside him because he feels so isolated.
So Michael turned to the one place where he felt he could be himself: the internet, creating a profile on a website that catered to alternative sex.
On his profile, he says he's looking for someone with more experience.
Michael is sort of reaching out saying, oh, I'd like to explore this fetish lifestyle. I'm willing to try anything.
So when sexy, older Tanya Bogdanovich sent him a private message, Michael couldn't believe his luck. Tanya was exactly the kind of woman Michael had been hoping to meet, and she seemed eager to take him under her wing.
All of a sudden you have someone saying, hey, you're an outsider, I'm an outsider too, but don't worry, I can show you the ropes.
The two flirted online for several weeks, sharing their darkest fantasies. And they discovered that they both shared one particular fantasy that was both unusual and taboo.
One of their main fetishes was this idea of rape play. And rape play is two consenting individuals. One is the aggressor, and one is the quote-unquote rape victim.
So one night in June, when Tanya's boyfriend and children were away, she and Michael decided to make their fantasy a reality. Michael drove to Tanya's house, where she answered the door ready and willing to be his submissive victim.
Their first date, or physical meeting, I suppose is the best way to put it, was a rape.
It was a life-changing experience for both of them, and they connected in ways neither had ever felt before in their lives.
When they connected fast and hard, and the relationship developed very quickly.
Over the next few months, the lovers continued to meet, fulfilling new fantasies. And the more they shared, the more intense their bond became.
The intimacy that developed between Tanya and Michael was of this sex, this aggressive, extreme, violent sex.
It was the first safe space they ever experienced. They found a partner who was willing to accept them exactly the way they are.
Though with a boyfriend and kids at home, Tanya had intended to keep romance out of her sexual hobbies. But as the affair stretched on for several months, she couldn't deny that her relationship with Michael had evolved beyond just sex.
They were spending more time together going out places, whether it was the beach or going out for lunch or whatever. And that's what sort of stemmed her to admit that it was an actual relationship.
Tanya was faced with an impossible choice between the stable, supportive family she'd always longed for and an exciting young lover who understood her in a way no one else ever could. Little did anyone then know that her decision would have deadly consequences and unleash an unspeakable evil that the town of Sarnia had never seen. Coming up, the disappearance of a local school teacher stuns a community.
This town was determined to find her.
And the search takes a dark turn when clues suggest a pair of local lovers might have something to do with the missing woman.
Yeah, this car with 2 people in it right around the same time frame as Miss Paquette's disappearance, one would have to think there's highly likely a connection.
Tanya Bogdanovich was a 30-year-old mother living a double life. By day, she was a caring nurse, but by night, she pursued a secret obsession with bondage and domination. Tanya had created a profile on a fetish website, looking for someone to fulfill her deepest fantasies. That's where she met 18-year-old college student Michael McGregor.
When this young man stepped forward and said, you know, you could probably talk me into doing anything, she jumped for it.
Although Tanya had young children and a stable boyfriend, their sex life had left her craving more. And the intense sexual bond she shared with Michael proved impossible to resist.
What started out as this fantasy BDSM sexual encounter grew into a love affair.
But while the lovers were exploring their darkest sexual urges, their peaceful town of Sarnia, Ontario, was about to be thrown into chaos. On New Year's Day, Sarnia police responded to reports of a missing person. 27-year-old Catholic schoolteacher Noelle Paquette vanished after leaving a party the night before.
Her cell phone's not working. Nobody's seen her. Nobody knows where she is.
Since it had been less than 24 hours, police were hopeful Noelle would turn up on her own. But by the next day, she was still missing, and detectives officially opened an investigation. Noelle's friends told police that she'd stormed out of the party after a drunken fight with her boyfriend. So detectives couldn't help but wonder if he had something to do with her disappearance.
Maybe the fight didn't end at the party. Maybe he followed her, and then things just got out of hand.
When officers tracked down Noelle's boyfriend, he admitted that he and Noelle had gotten into an argument at the party. But he said he knew better than to follow Noelle when she was angry. And witnesses confirmed that he didn't leave until much later. He also showed detectives a series of text messages he'd exchanged with Noelle on her way home, trying to apologize.
They text back and forth a few times, and then she stops replying.
Her cell phone started going unanswered at 2:45 a.m., and it was just radio silence.
Detectives knew she'd never made it home. So what happened to Noelle at 2:45? Searching for answers, police reviewed video recordings from traffic and security feeds along Noelle's route. And just as they'd hoped, she popped up on a series of closed-circuit cameras.
They were able to see her walking along the streets. They were able to get a very good timeline of when she left and then the last time that she was seen.
Camera footage along the street Noelle had been taking showed her headed toward a bus station around 2:45 a.m., the time when she suddenly stopped answering her phone. The cameras at the station should have picked up Noelle a few minutes later, but when police looked at the tapes, they discovered that she never got there.
She just vanished into thin air.
With no other clues to follow, police went public with the news of Noelle's disappearance, hoping someone might have seen her in the area that night. Within hours, the residents of Sarnia had mobilized to help find the school teacher.
She taught kindergarten at a Catholic school. She volunteered with children. She was beloved and not the sort of person who would get drunk and just wander away, which made people alarmed, very alarmed.
The community gets into action. They set up search parties, they start looking.
I'd say that probably everyone in Sarnia was trying their best to find her.
But 24 hours after the news went public, even the community's extensive search efforts had failed to turn up any sign of Noelle Paquette. Police were feeling pressure from both her family and townspeople to find answers. But they had no idea where to start. Until they received some unexpected help. On January 2nd, a highway patrolman was monitoring traffic outside of town when a startled motorist pulled up to tell him about a disturbing discovery he'd made just up the road.
This gentleman's driving down the road on his way to work, and he stops to brush off his truck, and as he's doing so, he sees some blood drops on the side of the road.
But when the officer drove back to the location to check it out, he found more than just a few drops of blood.
He also sees footprints leading into the forested area just off to the side of the road.
He decides, well, I'm going to investigate it a bit further.
The footprints led the officer deep into the woods before the trail abruptly ended. But just as he was about to return to his patrol car, he saw something lying in the grass.
The officer discovers a young, petite, white female, fully clothed, face down.
He can't see her face, but he can see her blonde hair, and he sees a large amount of blood.
He comes away with the very easy conclusion that she's deceased.
The officer called for backup. And when investigators turned the body over to identify the victim, everyone's worst fears were confirmed.
The dead woman was Noelle Paquette.
What they realized immediately is that the young woman had been brutally assaulted.
She had a number of stab wounds that were quite evident. And the most disturbing would be the incisions to her throat.
Her throat had been cut from ear to ear.
When the townspeople found out that Noelle had been murdered, the pressure on detectives to find out what happened to her became even more intense.
There was no explanation yet, so everybody was essentially scared and traumatized by this, trying to figure out who would have done this.
Meanwhile, Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor were still in the midst of their kinky affair. But while the lovers were pushing their boundaries in the bedroom, Sarnia police detectives were trying to figure out who killed Noelle Paquette. And the savage nature of the attack told them that this had not been a random act of violence.
You don't just stab someone that many times and cut their throat unless you have some really strong emotions, and whoever did this had a lot of aggression.
Investigators couldn't help but wonder, what kind of monster would slaughter a young woman like Noelle Paquette and leave her body in the woods?
Noelle was universally loved by people in the community. She volunteered with children. Here she was, the victim of a strange and brutal crime. Who would ever want to hurt Noelle Paquette?
Coming up, police learn about a harrowing incident that occurred the same night that Noelle disappeared.
A female exits the driver's side and she's covered in blood.
And the search for the killers leads police to focus on the twisted romance of Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor.
There was a lot of harm being done to each other, to the point where it no longer was role play, it was scary.
For months, Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor had been exploring their darkest desires.
They both were interested in pushing their boundaries, seeing how far they could go.
But their pursuit of pleasure had been overshadowed by the shocking murder of local schoolteacher Noelle Paquette.
She'd been stabbed almost 50 times. So this was a very frenzied, violent attack.
Had Noelle simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was it something more personal?
She was at a party, was on her way home. How is it that she ends up murdered? That became the real focus of the investigation.
The only evidence found at the scene were footprints leading to Noelle's body. At first, Police assumed the footprints had been left by two people, Noelle and her killer. But upon closer inspection, investigators realized there were not just two sets of footprints, there were three.
One set is Noelle, so that means they're not only looking for one killer, they're looking for two.
With little else to go on, police knew that finding Noelle's assailants would be a daunting task. Until detectives got the break they were looking for, when two highway patrolmen told them about a bizarre encounter they had on the same road and near the same spot where Noelle's body had been found. Around 4 a.m. on New Year's Day, the two officers had been patrolling the country roads when they came across a stranded vehicle.
They see a car. It's on the side of the road, but its lights are on. So their initial reaction is somebody's in distress. Let's go see if we can help.
But before officers had even gotten out of their cruiser, they were met with a surprising sight. A female exiting the driver's side and covered in blood.
And she's hysterical, she's crying.
The woman identified herself as Tanya Bogdanovich and explained that her lover Michael had been accidentally injured while the two were having sex by the side of the road.
They'd apparently driven out to the middle of nowhere to fulfill some kind of wild fantasy.
She said that they were into BDSM and that they liked knife play, and they'd gotten a little carried away, and he'd reached out for the knife and cut himself badly.
Tanya told the officers that she tried to take Michael to the hospital, but when they got back to their car, she discovered that she'd left the lights on.
She went to turn over the vehicle to try to go to get him help, and the vehicle was dead.
The officers radioed for an ambulance, and with no evidence of a crime taking place, they let Tanya and Michael leave without any charges.
The police are left with the impression that this is a consensual sexual act and that there's no kind of criminal activity.
But now, with Noelle Paquette's savage body discovered 1 day later, and close to the exact same location, detectives couldn't help but wonder if the couple had been covering something up after all.
Yeah, this car with two people in it, one of them suffering some stab injuries and at least one knife in the vehicle, right around the same time frame as Ms. Paquette's disappearance. One would have to think there's highly likely a connection.
Investigators ran background checks on the two lovers, and while Michael's didn't turn up anything out of the ordinary, Tanya's revealed that she hadn't always been the upstanding nurse and mother she pretended to be. Apparently, before she went to nursing school or met Michael online, Tanya told several of her close friends that she'd been indulging her kinky sexual desires working as a prostitute. Though Tanya had never been arrested, her friends told police that Tanya had admitted she sold her body for money and to satisfy her own sexual addictions. Detectives, though, knew that simply because Tanya used to be a prostitute didn't mean she was a killer. Police still needed evidence, and a stroke of luck seemed to help them find a potentially crucial clue. Because Tanya and Michael had left the scene that evening in an ambulance, the car she'd been driving had been towed, and records indicated she still hadn't picked it up from the lot where it had been taken.
Police officers are sent to seize the vehicle so that the vehicle can't be moved or tampered with until they decide whether or not to seek a warrant.
No sooner had detectives identified Tanya's car than she and Michael suddenly showed up at the police station.
Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor showed up, wanting to pick up her car.
Police department staff informed Tanya and Michael that if they wanted her vehicle released, they would have to answer detectives' questions first. A requirement that obviously annoyed the couple, but both agreed to answer questions about Michael's accident.
Now, tell me, how is it that you and Michael get together? What are you up to? What's going on?
This is, it's so humiliating and embarrassing when you hear it out loud. So I'm holding the knife. He reaches out and grabs it. My instinct is like, pull back.
I just kind of like grabbed the blade and hooked both my hands and started bleeding like crazy.
Is it pretty bandaged up?
Yeah, I'm going in for surgery tomorrow in London because I gotta get tendon and nerve repair.
On both hands?
Yeah.
When police called the hospital, they confirmed their story. Michael was scheduled for surgery the next morning. So far, Tanya and Michael's account of their sexual misadventure held up. But that didn't mean police were going to let two suspects slip through their fingers.
The police don't, at that point, feel that they have probable grounds to arrest them, so they keep them under surveillance.
To get an outside account of the couple's last 48 hours, police contacted friends and family. To their surprise, they discovered Tanya had a serious live-in boyfriend. And when police spoke with him, it became clear he didn't know Tanya was seeing anyone else.
Her boyfriend clearly has no idea what's going on and that she's having this kinky relationship with Michael.
He said that as far as he knew, Tanya had spent New Year's Eve with her best friend, a young woman named Maggie Geller. When detectives paid her a visit, Maggie told them she knew about Michael and was used to helping Tanya hide the affair from her boyfriend.
I think they were expecting me to be just as abrasive or just as secretive as Tanya and Mike. I was very transparent with them, and I just sort of told them exactly what I knew about Tanya and what had gone on since June and what I knew about Mike.
Maggie confirmed that Tanya had been swept up in the kinky affair with Michael that summer. And she could tell that the lovers' sexual adventures were helping Tanya work through her traumatic past. But over the past month, Maggie said the lovers had taken their experimentation to more extreme and dangerous places.
There was a lot of harm being done to each other, to the point where it no longer was role play. It was scary.
From what Maggie told investigators, it sounded like Tanya and Michael's story about consensual knife play was plausible. There was only one problem. Maggie told them that when Tanya called her from the hospital the next morning, she'd given a very different account of the accident.
She was obviously distraught. She said that they had gone to a kink party, so a BDSM party, and it went in the wrong direction, that someone came after her and Mike went to grab a knife and he ended up having to go to London Hospital for nerve damage in his hand.
At the time, Maggie didn't know the story Tanya and Michael told police. But even then, Maggie could sense that her friend wasn't telling her everything.
I didn't really put two and two together at that point, but I sort of had that gut feeling that not everything that she said was true.
But Maggie also confessed that Tanya had a good reason to lie to her. Upset by the increasing danger of Tanya and Michael's sexual activities, Maggie had threatened to reveal the affair to Tanya's long-term boyfriend.
I had told her that as soon as someone gets hurt, then that would be my breaking point.
So was Tanya lying to Maggie to protect her happy home and continue the affair? Or was the deception part of a web of lies meant to cover up a brutal murder?
You're telling various people about the party, but then you're telling police a completely different story. We don't know what the truth is now, but we know that they're covering something.
Coming up, shocking new eyewitness testimony blows the case wide open.
He sees what he believes to be a white male get into the rear of that vehicle.
And investigators suddenly find themselves in a race against time.
She said, "Take care of my family, and I love you, and you're the last person that I'm gonna call."
Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor shared passion for extreme sex. Their carnal obsession created an irresistible bond, which only intensified as they pushed their desires to increasingly darker and more dangerous places.
You have the relationship progressing to the point where they are both actively engaging in sexual fantasies of knife play, of rape, and things of that nature.
But the investigation into the stabbing of local schoolteacher Noelle Paquette had revealed the extent of the couple's violent obsessions and put them at the center of the murder investigation. So far, though, detectives hadn't been able to find any physical evidence connecting the couple to the crime, so they'd been forced to let Tanya and Michael go. But a day after their initial interviews with the couple, investigators caught a new break. A local man called police after seeing Noelle's picture on the news. and said he'd seen the school teacher on the night she disappeared. It had been the early hours of New Year's Day, not long after Noelle had left her boyfriend and friends behind at the party they'd been attending. According to the witness, Noelle had been walking along a dark street alone.
There was a gentleman that was working that overnight shift at a factory, and he had come outside to have a cigarette break, and he makes observations of a young blonde woman who's walking up the street.
The man said he'd watched Noelle walk a few blocks. Then, a white sedan suddenly turned onto the same street and slowly pulled alongside Noelle. From the man's vantage point, it looked like Noelle had stopped to talk to the driver. And after a few moments, Noelle had gotten into the car.
He had thought that maybe there was just a friend who was picking up a friend.
But what happened next struck him as very peculiar.
He sees the vehicle make another stop, and he sees what he believes to be a white male get into the rear of that vehicle.
The witness confirmed that the pickup happened around 2:45 a.m., just before Noelle disappeared. Detectives returned to the closed-circuit camera footage in the area in hopes of spotting the car. As luck would have it, they found a perfect still image of the same vehicle the witness had described.
The information allowed them to get cameras around that area that showed a white Grand Prix.
And it just so happened that the vehicle in the surveillance footage was the same model and had the same license plate as Tanya Bogdanovich's Grand Prix that had been impounded by police. To detectives, it was now certain that Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor were responsible for Noelle Paquette's disappearance, and most likely her murder.
At that point, they felt they had reasonable probable grounds to make the arrest.
But investigators would have to move quickly. After speaking to the witness to Noelle's abduction, detectives received a phone call from Tanya's friend Maggie Geller, who told them that Tanya had just called her to let her know that the police were after her and Michael, and that they were ready to go on the run.
She told me they were trying to pin Noelle's death on her, and that she was gonna be leaving because it wasn't her that did it. And then she said to me, take care of my family, and I love you, and you're the last person that I'm gonna call.
But police knew that Tanya and Michael had to do one thing before they made good on their threat to flee the area. Michael's hand injury required surgery that was scheduled for that same morning. Detectives knew if they hurried, there was a good chance they could catch the couple before Michael was discharged and arrest them before they could disappear.
Michael was going to be kept for a while for observation, so they did have a chunk of time where they knew where they would be.
2 undercover police officers followed Tanya around as she waited for the operation to be finished. They even picked up her cigarette butts and immediately had her DNA.
Detectives patiently watched until Tanya received word that Michael was ready to be released, then followed her out to the parking lot as she retrieved her rental car.
They placed her under arrest for first-degree murder.
But when investigators went back inside the hospital to catch Michael coming out of surgery, they were in for a surprise. According to the front desk, Michael had already been checked out.
Nobody had thought to put an officer on him because he'd been in surgery. So he actually walked out the front door of the hospital and was picked up by his father.
It's not as if the police grabbed Tanya and then waited an hour. They went quite quickly to get him. They missed him by a matter of seconds. Now, at this point, he's left in a vehicle. He could be anywhere.
Investigators questioned Tanya to find out where Michael was going. But if she knew, she wasn't willing to say. That's when detectives caught an enormous break, when Tanya's cell phone suddenly started ringing.
It's Michael's father trying to find out where she went. That gives police Michael's location.
Tracking the call to a nearby hotel, investigators were finally able to take Michael into custody. When his father answered the door, he seemed stunned to learn that police were looking for his son. And he was much more horrified when he realized that Michael was being charged with first-degree murder.
As far as he knows, Michael is this mild-mannered college kid. He has no idea the things his son is into.
But what could have compelled Michael and Tanya to commit such a heinous and unspeakable crime to an innocent schoolteacher. Why had they targeted Noelle Paquette, a young woman with whom they had no connection? And what exactly had they done to Noelle after they lured her into Tanya's car? When police pressed the couple for information, they each refused to speak. But a search of their phone and computer records soon helped provide investigators with some possible answers to these questions.
There's a whole collection of evidence that's there. All their electronic gadgets had all sorts of items of relevant interest to the police.
The police were able to get into Tanya's account where there was incredible stuff, all in order. Was the dark corner that had the worst rape fantasies.
The lovers had cataloged the escalation of their darkest desires. From the rape fantasy of their first date to their fascination with more violent activities.
There was an extraordinary amount of evidence. There were videos and photographs of the couple doing horrific violence to each other.
A number of public posts from late November showed the couple had even tried to recruit other women to take part in rape role-play scenarios.
They reached a point where violating each other and hurting each other wasn't enough. They needed to bring a third party into their relationship.
The lovers had been unable to find a willing partner. But by that point, Tanya and Michael's obsession and desire to inflict pain on the other person had grown to the point where they refused to be denied. So they agreed their next step would be to kidnap and assault a non-consenting victim.
There was a series of text messages going back and forth that set out their plan for the rape, abduction, and murder of various possible victims.
On Michael's 19th birthday, Tanya had presented him with a digital photo frame loaded with pictures from the social media pages of local girls who the couple identified as potential targets.
They eventually settled on a female student at Michael's college.
In their messages, the lovers set a date for the big event, New Year's Eve. But when they went to abduct their victim, she was nowhere to be found. That called for a change of plans. And the couple decided to go hunting for a random victim. The victim the couple just happened to have driven past that evening was Noelle Paquette. It had been cold that night, and Noelle, upset and alone after the fight with her boyfriend, gladly accepted the offer to drive her home from the woman she thought was a good Samaritan.
She was nothing more than a victim of circumstance. She really was a random person that they grabbed off the street.
Instead of a good Samaritan, Noelle Paquette had fallen victim to a pair of sadistic lovers. But would prosecutors finally learn what really happened to her that fateful night?
There was a lot of speculation on what exactly had happened, but nothing ever fully came out until the trial.
Coming up, terrifying details of the murder leave the jury in shock.
She'd been raped repeatedly.
But before their trial can conclude, Tanya and Michael make a shocking decision.
It was a sense of anger. It was a sense of defeat.
When 30-year-old Tanya Bogdanovich met 18-year-old Michael McGregor, she knew she'd finally found the man she could trust with her darkest desires. But the lovers' sadistic sex games had spiraled out of control. And now they were charged with the grisly slaying of local schoolteacher Noelle Paquette. Armed with a search warrant, investigators collected samples of blood from Tanya's Grand Prix and sent them to a crime lab for testing. Some of the blood came back as a match for the victim, Noelle Paquette.
They had the DNA. They were able to match that and that of the victims and put them in the same place at the same time. It was a strong case.
On the floor of the car, detectives also found the knife, which had traces of Noelle's blood on it, and the coroner's autopsy revealed even more horrifying details.
Most of her organs had been punctured. There was terrible damage around her throat, and she'd been raped repeatedly.
Combined with the couple's emails and text messages, Prosecutors believe they could piece together the events leading up to Noelle Paquette's brutal murder. After tricking Noelle into getting in Tanya's car, the couple had driven her to the woods, where Tanya held the knife to Noelle's throat while Michael raped her. Then, after Noelle had been sexually assaulted, the couple began to stab her over and over. In the midst of the frenzy, Michael cut his own hand, but that didn't stop the couple's bloodlust. According to Michael and Tanya's text after the murder, it had been the most erotic experience they'd ever had.
There was no defense after the viewing of these text messages. It's a very, very difficult case to defend.
This was premeditation. They had a desire, they made a plan, and they put that plan into action.
As their trial approached, the lovers seemed to realize how heavily the deck was stacked against them. Just weeks before they were to stand trial, Tanya and Michael surprised everyone by making an announcement.
It was finally disclosed to the general public that both Tanya and Michael had decided to plead to first-degree murder.
In statements issued through their attorneys, both Tanya and Michael claimed that their confessions hadn't been attempts to gain leniency, but instead expressions of responsibility and even regret for the crimes they committed.
She was genuinely remorseful for what she did and wanted to take responsibility.
It was Michael's decision that he didn't want to put his family and Noelle's family and the community through this excruciating process of, 5-month trial.
For most observers, the couple's expression of remorse was hard to believe, especially given the severity of Noelle's murder.
I knew that she was guilty. There's that part of you that hopes it's not. So when the guilty pleas came out, it was a sense of relief. It was a sense of anger. It was a sense of defeat.
It's terrifying to think that there are people like Tanya and Michael out there who do terrible things, and that's a really scary thought to go to sleep with at night.
On the night of Saturday, November 17, 1973, 5 teenagers from the Sioux Falls area drove toward Gitche-Manitou State Preserve in Iowa. They were young enough that the night still belonged to them. There was a fire waiting to be built, a guitar to play, conversations to have, and hours of darkness ahead before anyone expected them to go home. Roger Essam was 17. Stuart Bada was 18. His younger brother, Dana, was only 14. Michael Hadrath was 15. And Sandra Chesky, at 13, was the youngest of them all. Roger was Sandra's boyfriend. Stuart and Dana were brothers. The 5 had come together in Stuart's blue van, looking for a secluded place where they could spend the evening away from the ordinary routines of home. Nothing in the beginning suggested that this would become the last night 4 of them would ever see. There was no warning that the small group had crossed into a place where another group was already moving through the darkness. No one sitting around that fire knew that 3 men were nearby. Alan Fryer was 29 years old. David Fryer was 24. James Fryer was 21. The 3 were brothers from Sioux Falls. According to the case records, they had come into the area to poach deer. Their presence alone did not necessarily mean that the 5 teenagers were in danger. But at some point, the brothers discovered the teenagers and became aware that the group had marijuana. What began with that discovery would soon become one of the most devastating crimes in Iowa. At first, the teenagers were simply together. They had a fire. They talked. They played guitar. They used marijuana. The darkness around them was part of the setting, not yet a threat. But sometime after 10 o'clock, something changed. Sandra heard the sound of leaves being stepped on. It was the kind of sound that can disappear almost as quickly as it arrives, especially in a dark, wooded area. But this time, it meant that someone was approaching. Roger Essam and Stuart Bada left the fire to get more wood. They were moving through the darkness when Roger confronted whoever was there. Who are you? What do you want? It was a simple question, but there was no simple answer waiting for him. The three Fryer brothers had appeared. They were armed, and the situation began to move rapidly beyond anything the teenagers could have anticipated. The brothers returned to their truck to retrieve shotguns. Then they moved into a position from which they could look down toward the area where the teenagers were gathered. The people around the fire had not come prepared for a confrontation. They were teenagers spending a Saturday night together. They did not know that the men approaching them were not police officers, even though that was the impression the brothers would soon attempt to create. Then came the first shots. Roger Essam was killed. Stuart Botto was shot, but survived the initial attack. The remaining teenagers scattered into the darkness. Sandra, Dana, and Michael ran into the woods, trying to find somewhere to hide. In a matter of moments, the familiar setting had become a place of fear and confusion. The fire that had brought them together was now behind them. Their friends were injured or dead. Armed men were searching for them, and none of the teenagers could know what would happen next. The three brothers did not simply leave after the shooting. Instead, they called the remaining teenagers out of hiding. According to Sandra's later testimony, Alan Fryer presented himself as a law enforcement officer. The brothers claimed they were involved in a drug investigation and that they were going to seize the marijuana. That false identity mattered. Sandra was only 13 years old. Michael was 15. Dana was 14. They were facing adults with guns who were presenting themselves as people with official authority. Under those circumstances, the situation was no longer simply a violent confrontation in the woods. It had become an organized attempt to control the people who remained alive. Sandra and Michael eventually emerged from hiding. Michael had been shot in the arm. Alan continued to act as though he were a police officer, maintaining the story that the teenagers were being detained because of marijuana. Sandra, Dana, and Michael were forced to go with the men. James returned for the truck. Sandra was tied up and placed inside the vehicle. Alan drove away with her, leaving David and James behind with the other teenagers. That separation would become one of the most important moments in the entire case. Sandra was being taken away from the place where the group had gathered, while the people she had arrived with remained behind. She did not know what was happening to them. She did not know who was still alive. She could not know that the three boys who remained at Gitche Manitou would never leave the area alive. According to the case records, after Alan left with Sandra, David and James killed the remaining victims. Stuart Botto was killed. Dana Botto was killed. Michael Hadrath was killed. 4 teenagers who had begun the evening together had now been murdered. Roger was 17. Stuart was 18. Dana was 14. Michael was 15. Sandra, 13 years old, was the only one left alive. Alan continued driving with her. Eventually, they reached an abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota. The events there added another layer of violence to a night that had already become a massacre. According to Sandra's testimony, James Fryer sexually assaulted her. The brothers then discussed what they should do with her. At the farm, Sandra noticed something that seemed insignificant at the time: a large red fuel tank near the outbuildings. She could not have known that this image would later become one of the most important details in the investigation. Eventually, Alan took Sandra back home. Around 5 in the morning, she was released. She had survived, but she had lost 4 friends in a single night. When investigators began questioning Sandra, they were faced with a 13-year-old girl carrying information that could potentially identify the people responsible for the killings. She could describe the men. She could describe the vehicle. She could describe what they had said and how they had claimed to be police officers. She could describe the camp, the journey away from it, and the abandoned farm. Most importantly, she remembered the red fuel tank. At first, however, not everyone was convinced that her account was accurate. Some investigators questioned her because of her age and because she appeared remarkably composed. While recounting what had happened, she was questioned repeatedly and underwent a polygraph examination. According to the case records, she passed. Sheriff Craig Vinson was among those who believed Sandra and continued searching for the farm she had described. On November 29th, less than 2 weeks after the murders, Vinson took Sandra into the rural area around Hartford. They passed several farms. Sandra searched for something familiar, something she could connect to the place where she had been taken. Then she saw it, the red fuel tank. She recognized the farm. It was the place she had described. The farm was connected to a person who had employed Alan Fryer. And then another extraordinary coincidence occurred. Sandra and Sheriff Vinson saw Alan Fryer driving a brown pickup truck. Sandra recognized him. She identified him to Vinson. That's him. That's the boss. Police stopped the vehicle and Alan Fryer was arrested. David and James Fryer were arrested afterward. The search for the people responsible for the Gitche Manitou murders had reached its turning point. But the investigation was not yet over. The three brothers would give changing accounts of what had happened. Their stories would be examined against Sandra's testimony and the other evidence gathered by investigators. Eventually, the brothers would face separate legal proceedings, with different outcomes for each man. David Fryer would plead guilty to murder and receive a life sentence without parole for first-degree murder. Alan would be convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and receive 4 consecutive life sentences. James would be convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter, receiving 3 life sentences along with additional punishment for manslaughter. Yet before the courts reached those conclusions, there remained a question at the center of the case. How had a Saturday night that began with 5 teenagers around a fire become a massacre? The answer would unfold through the testimony of the only survivor. Sandra Chesky had entered Gitche Manitou with 4 friends. She left without them. The others would never tell their own stories of that night. Sandra would have to carry theirs with her. And the first clue that would eventually lead investigators to the men responsible was not a weapon, not a confession, and not a name. It was a simple image remembered by a 13-year-old girl. A large red fuel tank standing beside an abandoned farm in the darkness. On the evening of November 17, 1973, the 5 teenagers who traveled to Gitche Manitou were not expecting to become the center of a murder investigation. They were simply a group of young people spending a Saturday night together. Roger Essam was 17 years old. Stuart Bada was 18. Dana Bada, Stuart's younger brother, was 14. Michael Mike Hadrath was 15. Sandra Chesky was 13, making her the youngest member of the group. Roger and Sandra were boyfriend and girlfriend. Stuart and Dana were brothers. Together with Michael, they formed a small circle of teenagers who knew one another and had decided to spend the evening at a relatively secluded part of Gitche Manitou. They arrived in Stuart's blue van. Their destination was a place where they could sit around a fire, talk, play guitar, and spend time away from the ordinary surroundings of home. The setting mattered. Gitche Manitou was relatively isolated, and the group had chosen it precisely because it provided a quiet place to spend the night. There was nothing about the beginning of the evening that suggested an impending catastrophe. The teenagers built a fire and gathered around it. They talked. They played guitar. They used marijuana. For them, the night was still ordinary. It was a Saturday night shared among friends and siblings. Their ages alone reveal how young they were. The oldest, Stuart, was only 18. Roger was 17. Michael was 15. Dana was 14. Sandra was 13. 4 of them would not live to see another day. Sandra would survive, but she would become the only person capable of giving investigators a direct account of what happened. To understand the tragedy at Gitche Manitou, it is important to begin with the people who were there before the violence started, rather than with the men who eventually became their killers. Roger Essam was 17. He was Sandra's boyfriend, and he was one of the teenagers gathered around the fire that night. When the situation began to change, Roger was among those who confronted the unknown presence in the darkness. His question, "Who are you? What do you want?" would become one of the last known moments of ordinary interaction before the violence began. Stuart Botto was 18. He was Dana's older brother and was with the group that evening. At one point, Stuart and Roger left the fire to get more wood. Stuart would later become one of the 4 victims. Dana Botto was only 14. He had come to Gitche Manitou with his older brother Stuart and the other teenagers. His age is one of the details that makes the eventual violence particularly difficult to comprehend. He was still a young teenager, spending a Saturday evening with his brother and friends. Michael Hadrath was 15. He was also with the group when the 3 Fryer brothers appeared. During the attack, Michael was shot in the arm. He survived the initial shooting, but according to the case records, he was later killed after Alan Fryer left the area with Sandra. Sandra Chesky was 13. She was Roger's girlfriend and the youngest of the 5. Her experience that night would be different from the others. She would witness the attack, be taken away from the original scene, and eventually be returned home. She would then become the central surviving witness in the investigation. These 5 teenagers therefore entered Gitche Manitou together, but they would not leave together. That fact gives the setting of the evening a significance it could not possibly have had for them at the time. The place was simply somewhere to gather. Later, it would become associated with the deaths of 4 young people. While the teenagers were gathered around their fire, 3 other people were moving through the area. Alan Fryer was 29 years old. David Fryer was 24. James Fryer was 21. The 3 were brothers from Sioux Falls. According to the case information, they had come to the area to hunt deer illegally. Their original activity was therefore unrelated to the teenagers. But the encounter changed when they discovered the group and became aware that the teenagers had marijuana. That discovery became the beginning of the chain of events that led to 4 murders. The difference between the 2 groups could hardly have been greater. On one side were 5 teenagers, the youngest only 13, gathered around a fire with a guitar and talking among themselves. On the other were 3 adult men who were armed with shotguns. The teenagers did not know they were being watched. They did not know the identities of the men nearby, and they could not know what the discovery of marijuana would mean. At some point, the Fryer brothers decided to approach the teenagers. According to the case records, they took shotguns from their vehicle and moved toward the area where the group was gathered. The events that followed would later be reconstructed through investigation, testimony, and the changing accounts given by the defendants. But before the first shot was fired, there was a period when the teenagers were still simply sitting around their fire. That moment deserves attention because it represents everything that would soon be lost. 5 young people were together. Roger was with Sandra. Stuart was with his younger brother Dana. Michael was among friends. They had traveled together in Stuart's blue van and had chosen a secluded location for the evening. They had no reason to expect that the night would become a fight for survival. The first indication that something was wrong came from the darkness around them. Sandra heard leaves being stepped on. The sound was enough to make the atmosphere change. It was no longer simply a quiet evening in a secluded area. Someone was approaching. Roger and Stuart left the fire to get additional wood. Roger then called out to the people in the darkness. "Who are you? What do you want?" The question was direct, but the answer came from men carrying guns. The Fryer brothers returned to their truck, retrieved their shotguns, and moved into position. The teenagers had little reason to understand what was about to happen. They had not gone to Gitche Manitou expecting a confrontation with armed men. They had certainly not gone there expecting anyone to impersonate law enforcement officers. Yet according to Sandra's later testimony, the brothers would claim that they were police officers involved in a marijuana investigation. This false claim would become one of the defining elements of the case. It gave the attackers an appearance of authority while placing the teenagers in an increasingly dangerous situation. When the first shots were fired, the group's sense of safety disappeared. Roger Essam was killed. Stuart Botto was wounded. Michael Hadrath was wounded. Sandra, Dana, and Michael fled into the darkness. In those moments, the teenagers were no longer a group enjoying a Saturday night together. They were separated, frightened, and being pursued by armed adults. Yet the violence did not end with the first shooting. The men called the remaining teenagers out of hiding. Sandra and Michael eventually emerged. Michael had been shot in the arm. Alan Fryer continued presenting himself as a police officer and described the situation as a marijuana-related arrest. Sandra, Dana, and Michael were forced to go with the men. James returned to the vehicle, and Sandra was tied up and placed inside it. Alan then drove away with her. David and James remained behind with the others. This division would determine who lived and who died. The 4 victims were not strangers to one another. They were friends, brothers, and teenagers who had entered the preserve together. Roger was Sandra's boyfriend. Stuart was Dana's older brother. Michael was their friend. Their final hours were therefore not just the end of 4 individual lives. They were the destruction of a small group that had begun the evening together. As Alan drove away with Sandra, David and James remained with Stuart, Dana, and Michael. According to the case records, the 3 remaining teenagers were killed. By the time Sandra was taken away from the area, 4 of the 5 people who had arrived together were already on a path from which they would never return. The significance of the setting would become clear only afterward. Gitche Manitou had offered the teenagers privacy, but that same isolation also meant there were few immediate witnesses. The fire that had been a place of gathering became the center of a crime scene. The blue van that had carried the teenagers there became part of the story investigators would have to reconstruct. The darkness that had initially been nothing more than the natural setting of a Saturday night became the environment in which 4 teenagers were killed. And Sandra, the youngest member of the group, became the one person who could eventually connect the events at Gitche Manitou to the men responsible. The tragedy did not begin with a complicated plan known to everyone involved. It began with 5 teenagers choosing a secluded place to spend an evening and 3 men discovering them there. But once the Fryer brothers approached, the ordinary night disappeared. What followed would leave 4 young people dead, 1 13-year-old survivor, and an investigation that depended heavily on the memories of a girl who had every reason to be afraid. The story of Gitche Manitou was therefore no longer simply about what happened in a remote part of Iowa on one November night. It became a story about what Sandra remembered, what investigators were able to establish, and how the smallest details of that night would later become the means by which the people responsible were identified. By the time the evening of November 17, 1973, moved past 10 o'clock, the 5 teenagers at Gitche Manitou had already settled into the simple rhythm of a Saturday night together. They had come in Stuart Botta's blue van, found a relatively secluded area, built a fire, talked, played guitar, and used marijuana. Roger Essam was 17, Stuart Botta was 18. Dana Botta, Stuart's younger brother, was 14. Michael Hadrath was 15. Sandra Chesky was 13. Roger and Sandra were boyfriend and girlfriend, while Stuart and Dana were brothers. At that moment, they were still together. The night had not yet separated them. None of them knew that 3 men were nearby. Alan Fryer, 29, David Fryer, 24, and James Fryer, 21, had come into the area to hunt deer illegally. After discovering the teenagers and learning that they had marijuana, the brothers began moving toward the group. The teenagers did not know what was taking place beyond the edge of their firelight. Then Sandra heard something. It was the sound of leaves being stepped on. In a secluded place, a sound like that could have many explanations. But Sandra noticed it, and the atmosphere around the group began to change. The teenagers could no longer assume they were alone. Someone was moving through the darkness. At some point, Roger Essam and Stuart Botta left the fire to get more wood. They moved away from the others, toward the source of the disturbance. In the darkness, Roger called out, asking, "Who are you? What do you want?" It was an ordinary question in an extraordinary situation. Roger did not know who was approaching. He did not know why they were there. and he could not know that the people in the darkness were armed. The three Fryer brothers returned to their truck and retrieved shotguns. They then moved into a position that gave them a view down toward the area where the teenagers had been gathered. The group around the fire had no comparable weapons and no reason to expect an armed confrontation. Whatever assumptions the teenagers had about the people approaching them were about to disappear. The first shots were fired. Roger Essam was killed. Stuart Botta was shot, but survived the initial attack. Michael Hadrath was also wounded. The remaining teenagers, Sandra, Dana, and Michael, ran into the woods, trying to escape the men with guns. The transformation was immediate. Only moments earlier, they had been sitting together around a fire. Now they were running through the darkness, trying to find somewhere they could not be seen. The people they had been with were no longer simply friends around a campfire. Roger was dead. Stuart had been shot. Michael was wounded. Dana and Sandra were trying to survive. And the three men who had approached them were still there. The attack did not end with the first shots. According to the information in the case records, the Fryer brothers called the remaining teenagers out of hiding. This was when another element of the confrontation became especially important. According to Sandra's later testimony, the men gave the impression that they were law enforcement officers. They claimed to be involved in a marijuana investigation and said that they were going to seize the marijuana. The distinction mattered because the teenagers were very young. Sandra was only 13. Dana was 14. Michael was 15. The men confronting them were adults carrying shotguns. By presenting themselves as police officers, they created an appearance of authority that could make the teenagers believe they were facing an official arrest rather than an attack by armed civilians. Sandra and Michael eventually emerged from their hiding place. Michael had already been shot in the arm. According to the account that would later be presented in the case, Alan Fryer continued to act as though he were a police officer. He maintained that the situation involved marijuana and that the teenagers were being detained. The situation was no longer simply about the substance the men had discovered. The armed men were now controlling where the teenagers went and what they did. Sandra, Dana, and Michael were forced to go with them. James returned to retrieve the vehicle. Sandra was tied up and placed inside it. Alan Fryer drove away with her, while David and James remained behind with the other teenagers. This separation was a decisive moment. Before the attack, the 5 teenagers had been together. After it, their lives divided into 2 completely different paths. Sandra was being driven away from the place where they had gathered. Stuart, Dana, and Michael remained behind. Sandra did not know what would happen to them. She could not see what was taking place after she left. She had no way of knowing whether her friends were alive. The information available in the case records establishes what happened next. David and James killed the remaining victims. Stuart Botta, 18 years old, was killed. Dana Botta, 14 years old, was killed. Michael Hadrath, 15 years old, was killed. Roger Essam, 17, had already been killed during the initial attack. 4 teenagers were now dead. Only Sandra remained alive. The sequence of events is especially important because it shows that the violence did not end with the first confrontation. The initial shooting could have been followed by flight. Instead, the attackers continued to control the people who survived the first shots. They called them out of hiding, claimed to be law enforcement officers, separated them, and took Sandra away. While she was being driven from the area, the remaining teenagers were killed. Sandra therefore became the only surviving member of the group who could later describe the men who had approached them and the events that followed. The psychological position she occupied was unlike that of any other witness. She was 13 years old and had just watched her evening with 4 friends turn into a deadly attack. She had seen people she knew being shot. She had been forced to go with armed men. She had been separated from the others without knowing whether they were alive. And she was now being driven away by one of the men responsible. Yet she could not know that her survival would become central to the investigation. She could not know that investigators would later need her memory to identify the man. She could not know that a detail she noticed much later that night would help lead police to one of them. For the moment, she was simply being taken away. Alan Fryer continued to present himself as a police officer. Sandra was taken from the area in the vehicle while David and James remained behind. The men had created a story about a drug arrest, but the reality was far more serious. 4 teenagers had been killed. The marijuana that had apparently triggered the confrontation was no longer the central issue. The crime had become a mass killing, and Sandra was the only surviving witness who had been present at the beginning of the attack. The contrast between the beginning and the end of the encounter is difficult to ignore. The 5 teenagers had arrived together. They had shared a vehicle, a fire, music, conversation, and an ordinary Saturday night. Within a short period, 4 of them were dead. The 5th had been taken away. Their ages made the loss even more stark. The oldest victim was 18. The youngest was 14. Sandra was only 13. These were not adults caught in a conflict between armed groups. They were teenagers who had gone to a secluded place for the evening and encountered 3 armed men. The next stage of Sandra's ordeal would take her away from Gitche Manitou entirely. Alan would drive her toward an abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota. The events there would add another layer of violence to the night and would eventually provide investigators with one of the most important physical clues in the entire case. But before that happened, the reality at Gitche Manitou was already complete. Roger Essam was dead. Stuart Botta was dead. Dana Botta was dead. Michael Hadrath was dead. Sandra Chesky was alive. She had entered Gitche Manitou with 4 friends. She was now leaving with one of the men who had taken part in the attack. The fire, the guitar, the blue van, and the conversation that had filled the evening were now part of a crime scene. And somewhere behind her, 3 young lives had been extinguished. Sandra could not yet know that she would eventually have to tell investigators what she remembered. She could not know that her testimony would help connect the events at the preserve to 3 brothers from Sioux Falls. She could not know that the investigation would later depend on details she had seen while frightened and exhausted. For now, there was only the darkness, the vehicle, and the uncertainty of what would happen next. The night had begun with 5 teenagers together. It had become a murder scene with 4 victims and 1 survivor. And the only reason the story could eventually be reconstructed at all was because Sandra Chesky was still alive to remember it. By the time Alan Fryer drove away from Gitche Manitou with Sandra Chesky, the night had already become a tragedy. Roger Essam, 17, had been killed. Stuart Botta, 18, had been wounded and remained behind. Michael Hadrath, 15, had also been wounded. Dana Botta, 14, was still with them. Sandra was 13. She had been with these 4 people only a short time earlier, sitting beside a fire, listening to music, talking, and spending an ordinary Saturday evening together. Now she was alone with an armed adult who had taken her away from the others. She did not know what had happened to her friends after she left. She could not know whether Stuart, Dana, and Michael were still alive. She could not know that, according to the case records, they would not survive the night. Alan Fryer continued to present himself as a law enforcement officer. That claim had already been used during the confrontation at Gitche Manitou. The men had represented themselves as officers involved in a marijuana investigation, creating the appearance that the teenagers were being detained as part of an official investigation. For Sandra, who was only 13, the situation must have been defined by uncertainty. She had been confronted by adults with guns, had seen people around her shot, and had then been taken away from the scene. The men who controlled her had already demonstrated that they were willing to use violence. Yet the story they presented was still that of a police operation. That false identity was one of the details Sandra would later remember and report to investigators. It would become part of the evidence connecting the men to the events at Gitche Manitou. But at this point, the most immediate question was where Alan was taking her. He drove Sandra away from the preserve and toward an abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota. The journey separated her completely from the location where the killings had taken place. Behind her remained the scene where 4 teenagers would eventually be found dead. Ahead was an unfamiliar property where the ordeal would continue. When Sandra arrived at the abandoned farm, the 3 brothers were eventually together again. According to Sandra's testimony, James Friars sexually assaulted her. The assault represented another escalation in a night that had already involved murder and kidnapping. Sandra had been taken from her friends, transported against her will, and brought to an isolated property. Now she was subjected to further violence. The case records identified James as the person who sexually assaulted her. The event would later become part of Sandra's testimony and part of the evidence presented during the legal proceedings. The brothers then discussed what to do with Sandra. The situation was still under their control. She remained a 13-year-old girl in the presence of 3 adult men who had already been involved in the deaths of her friends. One detail from the abandoned farm would later prove especially important. Sandra noticed a large red fuel tank near the barn or outbuildings. At the time, it was simply something she saw while being held at the property. She had no reason to believe that this object would become significant to the investigation. But memory often preserves details without revealing their importance immediately. Sandra remembered the tank. That memory would eventually help Sheriff Craig Vinson locate the farm. The significance of that detail would emerge only after Sandra was safely back home and the investigation began. The brothers also discussed whether they should go into the house. According to the information provided for the case, Alan referred to going inside to find critters, but Sandra refused to go into the house. The precise significance of the statement remained part of the strange and disturbing sequence of events at the farm. What is clear is that Sandra did not enter the house. Eventually, Alan decided to take her away from the property. He drove her back toward home. The night was beginning to approach morning. Sandra had been separated from her friends for hours, and she had no way of knowing what had happened to them after she was taken away. The journey back, therefore, carried an uncertainty that would only be resolved when investigators discovered the bodies. Around 5 in the morning, Sandra was released. She survived. That fact would become the single most important circumstance in the investigation. Had she been killed as well? The case might have been left without a surviving eyewitness who could describe the men responsible. Instead, Sandra returned home carrying memories that would eventually lead investigators to them. She could describe the men who had approached the group. She could describe their claim that they were police officers. She could describe the vehicle. She could describe the sequence of events at the camp. She could describe being taken away. She could describe the abandoned farm. She could remember the red fuel tank. She could also recognize the person who had driven her away. But first, the investigation had to begin. On November 18th, the day after the killings, a couple visiting the Gitche-Manitou area discovered the bodies of Michael Hadrath, Stuart Botta, and Dana Botta near the road. Roger Essom's body was found at the campsite. Investigators were now confronted with the full scale of what had happened. 4 teenagers were dead. Their deaths had occurred in connection with the same evening and the same location. And one member of the original group was alive, Sandra Chesky. Her survival changed the nature of the investigation. She was not merely a witness who had arrived afterward. She had been there when the men appeared. She had heard the sounds in the darkness. She had seen the confrontation develop. She had experienced the deception involving the supposed police officers. She had been taken from the scene, and she had been brought to another location before being released. Her testimony could potentially explain what had happened during the hours when the 4 victims died. But Sandra's position as a witness was not immediately simple. Some investigators questioned her account. She was 13 years old, and some investigators reportedly found her composure unusual. The fact that she could remember details and describe the events did not automatically make everyone accept her story. She was questioned repeatedly. She also underwent a polygraph examination and, according to the case information, passed it. Sheriff Craig Vinson was among those who believed her account. Rather than dismissing her description of the abandoned farm, he continued searching for the place she had described. This became one of the most important decisions in the investigation. Sandra could not provide investigators with an address. She did not know the precise location. What she had was a memory of a rural property and, most importantly, the distinctive red fuel tank she had seen there. The investigation, therefore, depended partly on whether that memory could be matched to a real location. The process would take time. The murders had occurred on November 17th. Sandra had been released around 5 in the morning. The bodies were discovered on November 18th. Days passed while investigators worked to establish what had happened and who was responsible. During this period, Sandra remained central to the case. She was not only the surviving member of the group, she was also the person who could potentially identify the man. Her descriptions had to be examined carefully. Her account had to be compared with physical evidence and other information. And the farm had to be found. The investigation would eventually reach a turning point on November 29th. Sheriff Vinson took Sandra into the rural area around Hartford, South Dakota, searching for the abandoned farm. They passed through the countryside, looking for the features she remembered. Sandra had been there only under terrifying circumstances, but one object remained fixed in her memory: the large red fuel tank. Then she saw it. The tank matched what she remembered. Sandra recognized the property. The farm was connected to the person who had employed Alan Fryer. At that moment, the investigation moved from an uncertain search toward a direct connection with one of the suspects. And then another critical moment followed. Sandra and Sheriff Vinson saw Alan Fryer driving a brown pickup truck. Sandra recognized him as the man who had taken her away from Gitche, Manitou. She identified him to Vinson. "That's him. That's the boss." The sheriff stopped the vehicle. Alan Fryer was arrested. David and James Fryer were subsequently arrested as well. The memory of the red fuel tank had led investigators to the farm. The farm had provided a connection to Alan Fryer. And Sandra's recognition of Alan provided another crucial link. The investigation had begun with 4 dead teenagers and a 13-year-old survivor whose story some investigators initially questioned. It had now led directly to the men who would become the defendants in one of Iowa's most disturbing murder cases. But an arrest was only the beginning of the next stage. The 3 brothers would provide accounts of their involvement, and those accounts would not remain consistent. Alan would attempt to offer a different explanation of the shootings. David would also initially provide a version that would later change. Investigators would have to compare their statements with Sandra's testimony and the physical evidence. The case would eventually move into court, where the events of one November night would be reconstructed through testimony. For Sandra, however, the immediate reality was simpler and more painful. She had gone to Gitche, Manitou with 4 friends. She had returned alone. She could identify the man who had taken her. She could remember the farm. And she could remember the 4 people who would never come home. The investigation now had a direction, but the truth about the killings still had to be established. The next stage would involve interrogations, changing stories, arrests, and the gradual transformation of Sandra's memories into courtroom evidence. The morning after the attack at Gitche, Manitou, the investigation began with 4 dead teenagers and 1 surviving witness. Roger Essam, 17, Stuart Bada, 18, Dana Bada, 14, and Michael Hadrath, 15, were dead. Sandra Chesky, 13, was alive. She was the only member of the group who could describe the men who had approached them, what those men had claimed to be, what happened after the shooting began, and where she had been taken afterward. But having a surviving witness did not mean the case was immediately solved. Sandra's account had to be examined, questioned, and compared with what investigators could establish independently. Her age was one reason her testimony attracted particular attention. She was only 13, and some investigators found her manner unusually calm while describing events that had been terrifying and violent. Because of this, there were doubts about the accuracy of her account. Sandra was questioned repeatedly. Investigators needed to determine whether the details she remembered were reliable and whether they could be confirmed. She was also given a polygraph examination. According to the case information, Sandra passed the test. More importantly, she continued to provide details that gave investigators possible avenues to pursue. One of those details concerned the abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota. Sandra could not simply give investigators an address. She had been brought there under frightening circumstances and had not arrived as someone deliberately trying to memorize a location. Yet she remembered features of the property. One detail stood out: a large red fuel tank near the barn or outbuildings. It was a seemingly ordinary object, but it became an important part of the investigation because it gave Sheriff Craig Vinson something concrete to search for. Sheriff Vinson was one of the investigators who believed Sandra's account. Instead of treating the farm as an unreliable detail, he continued looking for it. The search required moving through rural areas around Hartford and comparing what Sandra saw with what she remembered. The investigation, therefore, became partly a process of matching memory to geography. Sandra had experienced the property at night and under extreme stress, yet she had retained an image that could potentially identify it. Meanwhile, the discovery of the bodies at Gitche, Manitou, had established the scale of the crime. On November 18th, a couple came into the area and discovered the bodies of Michael Hadrath, Stuart Bada, and Dana Bada near the road. Roger Essom's body was found at the campsite. The investigators now knew that 4 teenagers had been murdered in connection with the same evening. The condition of the scene and the accounts provided by Sandra indicated that the killings had not been an isolated confrontation involving only one victim. There had been an attack involving several young people, followed by the removal of Sandra from the scene. The question was who the attackers were. Sandra could provide descriptions, but investigators needed identities. The men had claimed to be law enforcement officers. They had spoken about marijuana and presented their actions as though they were conducting an official arrest. But they were not police officers. They were 3 brothers from Sioux Falls: Alan Fryer, David Fryer, and James Fryer. At this stage of the investigation, however, Sandra did not yet know their names. She knew what they looked like and remembered their behavior. She remembered the man who drove her away. She remembered the farm. She remembered the red fuel tank. Each piece of information had to be connected to something investigators could independently verify. The turning point came on November 29th, 12 days after the killings. Sheriff Vincent took Sandra into the rural area around Hartford in an effort to locate the abandoned farm. They passed through the countryside, searching for the location that matched her memory. Sandra looked carefully at the properties they encountered. The task was not simply to find a farm. It was to find the particular farm she had seen after being taken from Gitche, Manitou. Then she saw the feature she remembered: the large red fuel tank. Sandra recognized the property. The abandoned farm was located. Investigators also determined that the property belonged to a person who had employed Alan Fryer. This connection transformed Sandra's memory into an investigative lead. The farm was no longer an unidentified place described by a frightened 13-year-old. It could now be associated with a specific person and with one of the men Sandra had described. Then an extraordinary coincidence, or, from the perspective of the investigation, an extraordinarily important encounter, occurred. While Sandra and Sheriff Vinson were there, they saw Alan Fryer driving a brown pickup truck. Sandra recognized him. The man she had seen at Gitche, Manitou, and the man who had taken her away was suddenly in front of her. According to the case information, Sandra identified him to Vinson by saying, "That's him. That's the boss." The sheriff stopped the vehicle. Alan Fryer was arrested. The investigation that had begun with uncertainty now had a named suspect. The connection did not stop there. David Fryer and James Fryer were subsequently arrested as well. The 3 brothers who had been in the area on the night of the murders were now in police custody. Their arrest represented a major breakthrough, but it did not end the investigation. The next challenge was determining exactly what each brother had done. Their accounts did not remain consistent. Alan initially attempted to present a different explanation of the killings. He tried to suggest that the teenagers had fired first and that the deaths had occurred during confusion. The explanation did not survive scrutiny. In later questioning, Alan acknowledged involvement in the murders. Although he attempted to justify the events by referring to the teenagers' use of marijuana and alcohol. David initially gave a similar type of account before later changing his story and confessing. These changing statements were important because the investigation was no longer based solely on Sandra's recollection. Investigators now had the defendant's own statements to compare with the surviving witness's account and with the established facts of the crime. The differences between the statements also became significant when the case moved toward court. The brothers would not all face exactly the same legal outcome. Their individual statements, actions, and charges would be considered separately. David Fryer eventually admitted that he had killed Stuart Botta. Alan would later face trial for 4 first-degree murder charges, with Sandra's testimony becoming central to the prosecution. James would face a separate trial involving 3 first-degree murder charges and 1 manslaughter charge. Before those trials, however, investigators had to assemble the evidence carefully. Sandra's identification was important. Her description of the supposed police officers was important. The location of the abandoned farm was important. The red fuel tank was important because it helped establish that the place she described actually existed and was connected to Alan Fryer. The brown pickup truck was important because Sandra recognized Alan when she saw him driving it. And the arrests of the 3 brothers gave investigators the opportunity to confront their explanations with the surviving witness's account. The investigation therefore developed through a series of connections rather than a single piece of evidence. It began with Sandra's memory. Her memory led to the farm. The farm led to Alan Fryer. Alan's presence led to his arrest. The subsequent arrests connected David and James to the same investigation. What had initially looked like a seemingly impossible crime in an isolated area now had a clear group of suspects. Yet the central questions remained. Who fired the fatal shots? What role had each brother played? Why had the confrontation over marijuana escalated into the killing of 4 teenagers? And what exactly had happened during the hours after Sandra was taken away? The answers would eventually emerge through the defendant's changing statements and the testimony presented in court. For investigators, however, the breakthrough had already arrived. On the morning after the murders, they had 4 victims and a frightened 13-year-old survivor. 12 days later, they had located the farm she remembered and arrested the man she identified. Soon they had all 3 Fryer brothers in custody. The investigation had moved from an unidentified massacre to a case with named defendants. But the transition from arrest to conviction would require much more than suspicion. The prosecution would have to demonstrate what each brother had done, and the defense would challenge the evidence. Sandra would have to tell her story again, this time in a courtroom. The 4 teenagers who died could not speak for themselves. Sandra, therefore, carried a burden no 13-year-old should have had to carry. She had to describe what happened to her friends and identify the men who had taken them from her. Her memories, once questioned by investigators, were now becoming the foundation of a case. The next stage would take that evidence into court, where the 3 Fryer brothers would face very different legal paths. David would plead guilty to murder. Alan would stand trial for 4 first-degree murders. James would later stand trial for 3 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter charge. The investigation had found the suspects. Now the legal system had to determine their responsibility for the deaths of Roger Essam, Stuart Botta, Dana Botta, and Michael Hadrath. By the beginning of 1974, the investigation into the Gitche Manitou murders had moved into a new phase. The 3 Fryer brothers were no longer unidentified suspects. Alan Fryer, David Fryer, and James Fryer had been arrested, and the evidence gathered during the investigation had begun to define their individual roles. At the center of the case remained the testimony of Sandra Chesky, the 13-year-old survivor. Her account had helped investigators identify the abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota, and her recognition of Alan Fryer had led directly to his arrest. But identifying the suspects was only the beginning. The prosecution still had to establish what each brother had done and what responsibility each carried for the deaths of 4 teenagers. The legal outcomes would not be identical. The brothers would take different paths through the courts, and their individual cases would produce different convictions. The first major development came with David Fryer. On February 12, 1974, David entered a guilty plea to the murder charge. His admission was significant because it placed one of the 3 brothers directly inside the legal case rather than requiring the prosecution to prove every element of his involvement through a contested trial. David admitted that he had killed Stuart Botta. Stuart was 18 years old, the oldest of the 4 male victims. He had been with his younger brother Dana and the other teenagers at Gitche, Manitou when the 3 armed men appeared. He had been shot during the initial attack and remained at the scene after Alan left with Sandra. David's guilty plea established his responsibility for Stuart's death. The court found David guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. David later appealed, but the Iowa Supreme Court upheld the conviction. His case, therefore, became the first of the 3 brothers to reach a final legal resolution. The fact that David pleaded guilty did not erase the questions surrounding the larger sequence of events. 4 teenagers had been killed, and David's admission accounted directly for one of those deaths. The prosecution still had to determine the legal responsibility of Alan and James. Alan Fryer's case would become particularly important because Sandra had been taken away from Gitche, Manitou by Alan, and her testimony could place him directly in the sequence of events that followed the shooting. Alan's defense would attempt to challenge the evidence and offer an alternative explanation of what had happened. The prosecution, meanwhile, would rely heavily on Sandra's account. Her testimony had already guided investigators to the farm. It had helped identify Alan. Now it would be presented before a jury. The importance of her testimony went beyond a simple identification. Sandra could describe the evening from the perspective of someone who had been there from the beginning. She had been sitting with the other teenagers when the men approached. She had heard the movement in the darkness. She had seen the confrontation develop. She had witnessed the use of firearms. She had experienced the men presenting themselves as law enforcement officers. She had been taken away from the scene. She had been brought to the abandoned farm, and she had eventually been returned home. Her account provided a continuous narrative linking the beginning of the confrontation with the events that followed. At the same time, the prosecution had other evidence to place the brothers in the case. The 3 had been in the area together. They had been arrested after Sandra identified Alan. The abandoned farm had a connection to Alan through his employer. The vehicle and other identifying details were consistent with Sandra's account. Most importantly, the prosecution could point to the actions of the brothers after the initial shooting. According to the case records, Alan drove Sandra away while David and James remained behind with Stuart, Dana, and Michael. The 3 teenagers who remained were subsequently killed. This sequence was central to understanding the difference between the initial confrontation and the completed murders. The defense, however, had its own strategy. Alan initially attempted to present a different version of the shooting. He tried to suggest that the teenagers had fired first and that the deaths occurred amid confusion. Such a claim, if accepted, could have changed the way the jury understood his responsibility. But the account did not withstand comparison with the other evidence. Alan eventually admitted involvement in the murders while attempting to justify his conduct by referring to the teenagers' drinking and marijuana use. That explanation did not remove the central facts of the case. 4 teenagers had been killed. Sandra had been taken away, and the prosecution maintained that Alan was responsible for the deaths. The case against Alan, therefore, involved more than the question of whether he had been present. It required the jury to consider his actions, his relationship to the other two defendants, the testimony of Sandra, and the circumstances surrounding the killings. Sandra's testimony was particularly powerful because it came from the only person who had survived the attack and could identify one of the men directly. Yet her role also meant that she had to revisit the events repeatedly. She had already been questioned by investigators. She had undergone a polygraph examination. She had helped locate the abandoned farm. She had identified Alan. Now she would have to sit in court and describe the events that had killed 4 teenagers. Her testimony would put her memories into a legal record that would remain long after the trial ended. The prosecution presented her account as a crucial link between the men and the crime. The defense challenged the reliability and interpretation of the evidence. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's case against Alan. In 1974, Alan Fryer was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He received 4 consecutive life sentences. The result established that, legally, Alan was responsible for all 4 killings. His conviction also demonstrated the importance of Sandra's survival. Without her testimony, the prosecution would have lost the only living eyewitness who could describe the men's conduct during the initial confrontation and identify Alan. Her recognition of him near the abandoned farm had already helped police make the arrest. Her testimony in court now helped establish the case against him. But the legal story of the Fryer brothers was still not complete. James had yet to face his own trial. His case would differ from Alan's. James had been involved in the events at Gitche, Manitou, had remained behind with David after Alan took Sandra away, and had been identified by Sandra. Yet his final convictions would not match Alan's 4 first-degree murder convictions. James would ultimately be convicted of 3 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter. Before that happened, however, another extraordinary event would interrupt the legal process. Alan and James would escape from the Lyon County Jail. The escape occurred on June 18, 1974, after Alan's trial. The 2 men stole a vehicle and fled Iowa. 2 days later, the vehicle was connected to a hit-and-run near Gillette, Wyoming. The escape ended when authorities caught them and returned them to custody. Their escape did not erase their convictions, but it added another chapter to a case that had already moved from a remote campsite to police investigation, then to arrest and trial. The fact that 2 convicted men could escape custody after being held for such a notorious crime became another striking element of the story. For Sandra, however, the legal developments could not change what had happened on November 17th. Her friends were dead. Roger Essam had been killed during the initial attack. Stuart Bada, Dana Bada, and Michael Hadrath had been killed after Alan took Sandra away. David had admitted responsibility for Stuart's death. Alan had been convicted of all 4 murders. The remaining question concerned James and the precise legal responsibility assigned to him. The courts would address that question later in 1974. On December 20th, James Fryer was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. On January 7, 1975, he received 3 life sentences for the first-degree murder convictions, along with an additional sentence for manslaughter. The different outcomes were important. It would be inaccurate to describe the 3 brothers as having received identical convictions. David pleaded guilty to murder and was convicted of first-degree murder for Stuart's death. Alan was convicted of 4 first-degree murders and received 4 consecutive life sentences. James was convicted of 3 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter and received 3 life sentences plus an additional prison sentence. The legal record therefore reflected different findings for each defendant. Yet the central tragedy remained unchanged. 4 teenagers had died in a single night. Sandra, only 13, had survived and become the witness through whom the investigation could reconstruct what had happened. The courts had now assigned legal responsibility to all 3 brothers. But the story did not end with sentencing. Appeals, challenges to the convictions, and later court proceedings would continue. Alan, in particular, would continue to challenge his conviction. The legal system would have to revisit the evidence and determine whether the convictions should stand. Those later proceedings would examine the testimony, the evidence, and the arguments raised by the defense. But by the beginning of 1975, the essential legal outcome was clear. The three Fryer brothers had been convicted and sentenced. The surviving witness had been heard. The four victims had been named in the court record. And the events of one November night at Gitche, Manitou had become one of Iowa's most disturbing murder cases. For Sandra Chesky, however, the courtroom could never transform the past into something that had not happened. The convictions could establish responsibility, but they could not restore Roger, Stuart, Dana, or Michael. They could not return the group to the fire, the guitar, and the ordinary Saturday evening that had existed before the men emerged from the darkness. The law had reached its verdicts. The human consequences of that night would remain. By the time James Fryer's case reached the courtroom in late 1974, the Gitche Manitou murders had already produced two very different legal outcomes. David Fryer had pleaded guilty to murder and had been found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Stuart Botta. Alan Fryer had faced trial and been convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder, receiving 4 consecutive life sentences. James now stood as the final brother whose responsibility had to be determined in court. His case was especially important because the events of November 17, 1973, had involved 3 defendants whose actions overlapped but were not legally identical. The prosecution, therefore, had to establish James's responsibility based on the evidence available, while the defense had the opportunity to challenge the accusations and the interpretation of his conduct. At the center of the case remained the events at Gitche, Manitou, and the testimony of Sandra Chesky. Sandra had survived the attack and had provided investigators with information that helped connect the crime to the Fryer brothers. She had described the men who approached the teenagers, the firearms, the false claim that they were law enforcement officers, and the events that followed. Her identification had helped investigators find Alan Fryer and later identified David and James. But James's trial required the court to consider his own role rather than simply assume that every brother had acted in exactly the same way. According to the case information, James had remained at Gitche, Manitou after Alan left with Sandra. David was also still there. Stuart, Dana, and Michael were the 3 teenagers who remained behind. All 3 would be killed. This sequence was central to James's case. The prosecution had to connect him to the deaths that occurred after Sandra was taken away. The evidence presented in the case indicated that James was one of the men who remained at the scene and participated in the killings. Yet the final charges against him were different from those faced by Alan. On December 20th, 1974, James Fryer was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. The verdict meant that the jury found him legally responsible for 3 deaths at the highest level of homicide recognized in the case, while a 4th charge resulted in a manslaughter conviction rather than first-degree murder. The distinction mattered. The legal record did not treat the 3 brothers as interchangeable defendants. David had admitted killing Stuart. Alan had been convicted of 4 first-degree murders. James had been convicted of 3 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter. These differences reflected the evidence and legal findings in each individual case. On January 7, 1975, James was sentenced to 3 life terms for the 3 first-degree murder convictions, along with an additional prison sentence for manslaughter. With that sentencing, the courtroom phase of the Gitche Manitou case reached an important conclusion. All 3 Fryer brothers had now been convicted and sentenced in connection with the murders. For the families and friends of the 4 victims, however, the verdicts could not change the events of November 17th. The 4 teenagers had been together earlier that evening. Roger Essam was 17. Stuart Botta was 18. Dana Botta was 14. Michael Hadrath was 15. Their ages were important because they emphasized how young the group had been. Even Stuart, the oldest of the 4 male victims, was only 18. Dana was 14. Michael was 15. Roger was 17. Sandra, the lone survivor, was only 13. The case, therefore, involved a group of teenagers whose ordinary evening had ended in 4 deaths. The verdicts established legal responsibility, but they could not restore the lives that had been lost, nor could they erase the memories Sandra carried from that night. She had not only survived the attack, she had later been required to describe it. Her recollections had been questioned during the investigation, and she had been examined repeatedly. She had passed a polygraph examination according to the case information. She had then helped Sheriff Craig Vinson locate the abandoned farm by recognizing the large red fuel tank. When Alan Fryer appeared nearby in a brown pickup truck, she recognized him. Her statement, "That's him, that's the boss," became one of the most memorable moments in the investigation because it connected the survivor's memory directly to a suspect. The subsequent legal proceedings transformed that memory into courtroom evidence. But even after the convictions, the case was not entirely finished. Alan Fryer continued to challenge his conviction through later legal proceedings. His appeals and post-conviction challenges questioned aspects of the evidence and the legal process. The courts examined those claims rather than simply assuming that the original verdict ended every legal question. In 1985, a federal appellate court considered Alan's challenge and rejected it, leaving his conviction in place. The court concluded that the evidence was sufficient for a reasonable jury to find him guilty. This later ruling was important because it demonstrated that the case continued beyond the original trials. The legal system revisited arguments about the evidence and the conduct of the proceedings, but the convictions remained. Another extraordinary development had already occurred during the original legal process. On June 18, 1974, Alan and James escaped from the Lyon County Jail. Their escape came after Alan's trial. The 2 men stole a vehicle and fled Iowa. 2 days later, the vehicle became connected to a hit-and-run near Gillette, Wyoming. Authorities eventually caught them and returned them to custody. The escape did not alter the murder convictions, but it added another disturbing chapter to the case. The men who had already been accused and convicted in connection with the Gitche Manitou murders had attempted to escape the legal consequences of their actions. They were recaptured, and the legal process continued. By the time James received his sentence in January 1975, the essential facts of the case had been established in court. 4 teenagers had died. 1 13-year-old girl had survived. 3 brothers had been identified, arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. Their individual legal outcomes differed, but none of them escaped responsibility for their involvement. David was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole after his first-degree murder conviction. Alan received 4 consecutive life sentences for 4 first-degree murder convictions. James received 3 life sentences for 3 first-degree murder convictions and an additional sentence for manslaughter. The case therefore reached a point where the judicial system had rendered its judgments. But there remained a question that no verdict could answer completely. Why had a confrontation involving marijuana escalated into the deaths of 4 teenagers? The case information indicates that the discovery of marijuana was an important part of the confrontation, and that the brothers represented themselves as narcotics officers. But the precise psychological transition from an attempted seizure of marijuana to multiple killings remains difficult to reduce to a single explanation. The violence went far beyond the original stated purpose of the encounter. The teenagers were not simply confronted and arrested. They were attacked with firearms. Sandra was taken away from the scene. 3 of the victims remained behind and were killed. Sandra was transported to an isolated farm, where she was sexually assaulted before eventually being released. The progression of events is one of the most disturbing elements of the case because each stage created another opportunity for the violence to stop. Yet the violence continued. The final verdicts could describe responsibility in legal terms, but they could not fully explain the human decisions that produced the tragedy. For Sandra, the most lasting consequence was survival. She became the person who could tell investigators what the four victims could no longer say. Her testimony helped reconstruct the night and identify the people responsible. Yet survival in this case did not mean escaping the consequences. She had lost 4 friends in a matter of hours and had experienced violence herself. Her memories became evidence because there was no other living member of the group who could describe the entire sequence from the first encounter to her removal from the scene. The legal system depended on that testimony. But behind every piece of evidence was a 13-year-old girl describing an experience that had permanently changed her life. The Gitche Manitou murders, therefore, cannot be understood only as a sequence of arrests and convictions. The court records provide the legal framework, but the human story begins with 5 teenagers who went out together on a Saturday night and ends with 4 of them dead. Roger, Stuart, Dana, and Michael were not simply names in a criminal case. They were the 4 young people whose lives ended at Gitche Manitou. Sandra was the 5th member of the group, the one who survived and carried their story forward. The convictions of the Fryer brothers established accountability. David's guilty plea, Alan's 4 murder convictions, and James's 3 murder convictions and manslaughter conviction provided the legal conclusions. Later appeals confirmed that the convictions would stand. Yet the final judgment of a court is not the same thing as closure for those who remain. The case continued to be remembered because of the ages of the victims. The randomness of the encounter, the deception used by the attackers, the survival of Sandra, and the extraordinary path by which her memory led investigators to the people responsible. The story that began beside a campfire had ended in a courtroom, but its consequences extended far beyond the courtroom doors. For families had lost young people. 1 survivor had been forced to become a witness, and 3 brothers had spent the rest of their lives facing the consequences of convictions arising from one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes. By the beginning of 1975, the legal proceedings against the Fryer brothers had reached their essential conclusion. David Fryer had pleaded guilty to murder and had been convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Stuart Botta. Alan Fryer had been convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. James Fryer had been convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter, receiving 3 life sentences along with an additional sentence for manslaughter. The men responsible for the deaths had been identified, prosecuted, and sentenced. Yet a criminal conviction is not the same thing as an ending. For the families of Roger Essam, Stuart Botta, Dana Botta, and Michael Hadrath, the verdicts could not restore the 4 young lives lost on November 17, 1973. And for Sandra Chesky, the 13-year-old survivor, the end of the trials did not mean that the night disappeared. She remained the person who had survived the attack and the person whose memory had helped investigators reconstruct what had happened. The significance of Sandra's survival cannot be separated from the outcome of the investigation. When investigators first approached the case, they had 4 dead teenagers and very little certainty about who had killed them. The attack had taken place in an isolated area. The perpetrators had left the scene. There was no surviving adult eyewitness who could identify them. Sandra was only 13, and investigators initially had doubts about aspects of her account. Yet she continued to describe the men, the circumstances surrounding the attack, the journey away from Gitche Manitou, and the abandoned farm. She underwent repeated questioning and passed a polygraph examination according to the case. Information. Sheriff Craig Vincent believed her account and continued searching for the location she described. That decision eventually changed the direction of the entire case. The red fuel tank that Sandra remembered became the clue that allowed investigators to locate the farm. Once the property was identified, the connection to Alan Fryer emerged. Then Sandra saw Alan driving a brown pickup truck. She recognized him. Her identification gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. What had begun as the memory of a frightened 13-year-old became a direct connection to one of the suspects. David and James were subsequently arrested, and the 3 brothers entered the criminal justice system. This sequence is one of the most important aspects of the case because it demonstrates how an investigation can depend upon a detail that initially appears insignificant. Sandra did not know the name of the farm. She did not know the identity of the men who had taken her. She knew only what she had seen and remembered. The large red fuel tank was one of those memories. In isolation, it might have seemed like a small detail. In combination with everything else she described, it became a path toward the suspects. The legal proceedings also established that the three brothers did not receive identical outcomes. That distinction matters when remembering the case. David's guilty plea concerned the murder of Stuart Botta. He admitted that killing and received a first-degree murder conviction and life imprisonment without parole. Alan faced 4 first-degree murder charges and was convicted on all 4, receiving 4 consecutive life sentences. James faced 4 charges, but was convicted of 3 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter. He received 3 life sentences and an additional sentence for manslaughter. These different outcomes reflected the individual legal proceedings rather than a single collective judgment against all 3 brothers. The courts examined their cases separately and assigned responsibility according to the convictions reached in each case. The legal history did not end immediately after sentencing. Alan continued to challenge his conviction through later proceedings. His claims included challenges involving evidence and the legal process. In 1985, a federal appellate court rejected his challenge and left the conviction in place. The court concluded that the evidence was sufficient to support the jury's finding of guilt. That later ruling reinforced the original legal conclusion that Alan was responsible for the 4 murders. James and Alan had also previously demonstrated that the legal consequences did not prevent further attempts to escape custody. On June 18, 1974, the 2 escaped from the Lyon County Jail. They stole a vehicle and fled Iowa. 2 days later, the vehicle was associated with a hit-and-run near Gillette, Wyoming. Authorities caught them and returned them to custody. The escape became another chapter in the history of the case, but it did not change the convictions that followed. The larger significance of Gitche Manitou lies partly in the ages of the victims. Roger Essam was 17. Stuart Botta was 18. Dana Botta was 14. Michael Hadrath was 15. They were teenagers who had gone to a secluded place for an evening together. Their plans were ordinary: a fire, conversation, guitar, and time with friends. The events that followed were anything but ordinary. Their deaths transformed a Saturday night into a crime that would remain in the records of Iowa's criminal justice system for decades. Sandra was even younger than the 4 boys. At 13, she became the only survivor of the group. She had to carry memories of the attack while also providing information that investigators needed. Her role in the case was therefore unusual. She was simultaneously a victim, a survivor, a witness, and eventually a central figure in the prosecution's effort to establish what happened. Her testimony could not bring the other 4 teenagers back, but it could ensure that their deaths were not left without explanation. The 4 victims had no opportunity to tell investigators what they had seen after the first shots. Sandra had that opportunity because she survived. That fact gives her testimony a particular importance in the historical record of the case. The Gitche Manitou murders also remain disturbing because of the progression of the violence. The confrontation appears to have begun after the 3 brothers discovered that the teenagers had marijuana. The men then represented themselves as law enforcement officers. What followed was not a simple confrontation over drugs. Firearms were used. Roger was killed. Stuart and Michael were wounded. Sandra, Dana, and Michael were controlled by the attackers. Alan then took Sandra away, while David and James remained with the others. Stuart, Dana, and Michael were killed. Sandra was transported to an abandoned farm, where James sexually assaulted her. She was later returned home. The sequence demonstrates how rapidly the situation escalated and how many separate decisions were made after the first violence began. The tragedy, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single moment. It was a chain of actions that resulted in 4 deaths and left one young survivor carrying the memory of what happened. There is also an important distinction between explaining a crime and excusing it. The case information identifies marijuana as a factor in the initial confrontation, but that does not explain or justify the scale of the violence that followed. The teenagers' possession or use of marijuana did not make them responsible for their own deaths. They were young people confronted by 3 armed men who had decided to take control of the situation. The victim's behavior that evening should therefore be understood in its proper context. They were teenagers spending time together, not people responsible for the violence committed against them. That distinction is especially important in a case where the perpetrators attempted to portray themselves as authorities. By pretending to be police or narcotics officers, the men used the appearance of legitimate authority to control people who were already vulnerable. The deception made the confrontation more dangerous because the teenagers could not reasonably understand the true nature of the threat they faced. The case also demonstrates the importance of careful investigation. Sandra's initial account could have been dismissed because of her age or because some investigators found her demeanor unusual. Instead, Sheriff Vincent continued to investigate the details she provided. The farm was found. The red fuel tank matched her memory. Alan appeared at the location. Sandra identified him. David and James were subsequently arrested. The investigation moved forward because someone was willing to treat the survivors' memories as evidence rather than as an inconvenience. In the end, the Gitche Manitou murders became a case defined by 5 young people, 4 who died and 1 who survived. Roger, Stuart, Dana, and Michael never had the opportunity to grow older, to leave the memories of that night behind, or to decide what their futures would become. Sandra survived, but survival came with the responsibility of remembering. The courts later established the guilt of the 3 Fryer brothers, and later challenges failed to overturn the convictions. Yet the most enduring part of the case is not the sentences themselves. It is the contrast between the beginning and the end of that night. 5 teenagers went to Gitche Manitou together. 4 never came home. 1 did. And because Sandra came home, investigators were eventually able to connect a series of memories to a place to a suspect, and a suspect to a crime. The case therefore remains a reminder that even in an investigation involving uncertainty, the testimony of a survivor can become the thread that connects seemingly separate pieces of evidence. In Gitche Manitou, that thread began with a 13-year-old girl remembering what she had seen. It led to a red fuel tank, an abandoned farm, a brown pickup truck, and the identification of Alan Fryer. From there came arrests, confessions, trials, convictions, sentences, appeals, and continued legal proceedings. But beneath all of those legal developments was the same human fact. 4 teenagers were dead. Their names were Roger Essam, Stuart Botta, Dana Botta, and Michael Hadrath. They had gone into the night together. Only Sandra Chesky came back. The court could determine who was responsible. It could impose sentences. It could preserve the facts in official records. But it could not undo November 17, 1973. That is why the Gitche Manitou murders remain more than a criminal case. They are the story of 4 young lives ended in a matter of hours. 1 13-year-old survivor whose memories helped solve the crime, and an investigation that turned a small detail remembered from a frightening night into the evidence that ultimately led authorities to the men responsible. The convictions of the Fryer brothers brought the formal courtroom phase of the Gitche Manitou murders toward its conclusion. But the case did not become simple merely because the courts had reached their verdicts. A criminal investigation can establish responsibility without answering every question surrounding a tragedy. In Gitche Manitou, the central facts were established: 4 teenagers were killed. Sandra Chesky survived. The 3 Fryer brothers were identified and prosecuted, and each was ultimately convicted. Yet the circumstances surrounding the escalation of the violence remained disturbing. The case had begun with an encounter involving marijuana. It had ended with 4 deaths, a sexual assault, an abandoned farm, arrests, trials, an escape from custody, and years of legal challenges. The distance between the beginning and the end was enormous. And understanding that distance requires looking carefully at what was known without inventing explanations that the evidence does not establish. The first question concerns the original reason for the confrontation. According to the case information, the Fryer brothers were in the Gitche-Manitou area to hunt deer illegally when they discovered the teenagers and became aware that the group had marijuana. The brothers then decided to take the marijuana. They approached the group with firearms and represented themselves as narcotics officers or law enforcement personnel. That deception was crucial. The teenagers were not simply confronted by strangers openly announcing that they intended to rob them. Instead, the men created the impression that they possessed legitimate authority. For the teenagers, this changed the nature of the encounter. They were young, isolated in a remote area, and confronted by armed adults claiming to be police. The case does not provide a legitimate explanation for why the brothers chose to continue using violence after the marijuana became the focus of the confrontation. Whatever the original intention had been, the situation escalated far beyond it. Roger Essam was shot and killed. Stuart Bada and Michael Hadrath were wounded. Sandra, Dana, and Michael attempted to hide. The men then brought some of them under control. Eventually, Alan left the scene with Sandra, while David and James remained behind. Stuart, Dana, and Michael were killed. The question is not whether the killings occurred. The convictions established that. The more difficult question is how the brothers moved from an attempted seizure of marijuana to the decision to kill 4 young people. The available information does not justify inventing a single psychological motive. It is more accurate to acknowledge that the violence escalated in stages and that the legal record established responsibility without providing a complete explanation of every decision made during those stages. Another important question concerns Sandra's survival. She was 13 years old and was the only member of the group to survive. After being taken from Gitche-Manitou, she was transported to the abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota. According to her testimony, James sexually assaulted her there. She was later taken home by Alan and released at approximately 5 in the morning. Her survival was extraordinary in practical terms because it left investigators with a living witness. But it is important not to treat her survival as a convenient plot device. Sandra was a victim of the same attack. She lost 4 friends and experienced violence herself. The fact that her memories later became central evidence does not change that reality. During the investigation, some officers initially questioned her account. Her age and demeanor contributed to doubts about whether her recollections could be trusted. Yet she continued to provide information. She passed a polygraph examination according to the case information. Most importantly, the details she remembered led investigators toward evidence outside her own testimony. The abandoned farm was located because of her description. The large red fuel tank became a recognizable feature. The farm was connected to Alan Fryer through his employment. Then Sandra saw Alan in a brown pickup truck and identified him. This sequence strengthened her account because it connected her memory to physical circumstances and, ultimately, to a suspect. The case therefore demonstrates why witness testimony should not be judged only by how a witness appears emotionally. A person who has survived extreme violence may not behave in the way investigators expect. Sandra's ability to remain composed enough to describe details did not mean the experience had been insignificant. Her memories became valuable because they were specific and because investigators were able to test them against other information. Another question concerns the division of responsibility among the brothers. The legal outcomes show that the courts did not simply treat the 3 men as a single unit. David pleaded guilty and was convicted of first-degree murder for Stuart Bada's death. Alan was convicted of 4 first-degree murders. James was convicted of 3 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter. Those distinctions are significant. They remind us that participation in a crime can involve different acts and different findings of criminal responsibility. The surviving records therefore require careful language. It would be inaccurate to say that all 3 brothers received exactly the same convictions for exactly the same deaths. The legal system examined each case separately. Alan's trial relied heavily on Sandra's testimony and resulted in 4 first-degree murder convictions. David's case was resolved through a guilty plea. James's trial resulted in a combination of first-degree murder and manslaughter convictions. Together, however, the 3 cases established that all 3 brothers were criminally responsible for their involvement in the events that killed the 4 teenagers. Another unresolved element is the role of the false police identity. The men's claim that they were narcotics officers was not a minor detail. It was part of the mechanism by which they gained control over the teenagers. It also created confusion about what the victims were experiencing. If someone claims to be a police officer, a young person may believe that compliance is required. In this case, the men used that appearance while carrying firearms and confronting teenagers in an isolated location. The deception therefore became part of the larger pattern of control. The case also raises a question about how close the investigation came to losing its most important witness. Sandra could have been killed at the same time as the others. If that had happened, investigators might have faced a crime scene with 4 dead teenagers and no surviving eyewitness capable of describing the attackers. There is no basis for claiming that the brothers deliberately spared Sandra in order to create some particular outcome. The evidence simply shows that she survived and was eventually released. That survival changed the investigation. She could describe the men. She could describe the vehicle. She could describe the farm. She could recognize Alan. Her memory provided investigators with a path that otherwise might not have existed. The later escape of Alan and James also became part of the case's unusual history. On June 18, 1974, they escaped from the Lyon County Jail. They stole a vehicle and fled Iowa. 2 days later, the vehicle was associated with a hit-and-run near Gillette, Wyoming, and the 2 men were captured and returned to custody. The escape did not undermine the convictions, but it demonstrated that the legal process was not a straight line from arrest to final punishment. There were interruptions, appeals, and additional proceedings. Alan later continued to challenge his conviction, including through federal proceedings. In 1985, a federal appellate court rejected his challenge and left the conviction intact. The court determined that the evidence was sufficient to support the jury's verdict. This later review is important because it shows that the convictions were not simply accepted without examination. The evidence was tested through the appellate system, and the convictions remained. But perhaps the most important question is what happened to the memory of the victims. Criminal cases naturally become centered on suspects, evidence, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and verdicts. Yet the people at the center of the Gitche Manitou tragedy were 4 teenagers who never had the opportunity to participate in any of those later proceedings. Roger Essam was 17. Stuart Bada was 18. Dana Bada was 14. Michael Hadrath was 15. Their identities could easily become statistics when the case is summarized as 4 murders. But the ages alone remind us of how much of their lives remained unwritten. They had friends, families, plans, and ordinary interests. The available information tells us that they spent that evening together with a fire, a guitar, and conversation. The tragedy is that the evening ended before they could return to those ordinary lives. Sandra's survival provides the only direct human bridge between the teenagers' final evening and the investigation that followed. Her testimony allowed the authorities to reconstruct what had happened, but her survival also meant that she had to live with the knowledge that she was the only one who came back. That is a burden no verdict can remove. The courts could establish responsibility, and the sentences could impose punishment. but neither could restore the 4 lives lost. The Gitche Manitou murders, therefore, remain disturbing not because the case is unresolved in the legal sense, but because some questions are fundamentally different from questions of guilt. The courts answered who was responsible. They established the convictions. They imposed life sentences. Appeals failed to overturn the central judgments. What remains more difficult is the human question of how an ordinary evening among teenagers could turn into such devastating violence. The evidence allows us to describe the progression. It does not allow us to manufacture a deeper motive where none has been established. That distinction matters. A responsible account of the case does not need to invent thoughts inside the killer's minds. The known facts are already terrible enough. 3 armed men confronted 5 teenagers. They used the appearance of authority to control them. 4 teenagers died. 1 13-year-old girl survived. Her memories led investigators to the farm, and her recognition of Alan Fryer helped bring the case to its turning point. The brothers were prosecuted and convicted. The legal system ultimately recorded their responsibility. But the final measure of the tragedy is not found in the number of convictions or the length of the sentences. It is found in the names of the 4 young people who never came home: Roger Essam, Stuart Botta, Dana Botta, Michael Hadrath. Their story began as an ordinary Saturday night. It ended in violence that changed the lives of everyone connected to it. Sandra's survival ensured that the truth of that night could be told. And decades later, the most important lesson remains the simplest one: behind every case number, every indictment, every courtroom argument, and every sentence, there are human lives that cannot be restored once they are taken away. By the time the legal challenges surrounding the Gitche Manitou murders had run their course, the facts of the case had been preserved in court records, testimony, and appellate decisions. The 3 Fryer brothers had been held responsible through separate legal proceedings, and the convictions remained in place. But the passage of time did not change the most basic fact of November 17, 1973. 4 teenagers went into Gitche Manitou together, and only one of the 5 came home. Roger Essam was 17. Stuart Botta was 18. Dana Botta was 14. Michael Hadrath was 15. Sandra Chesky was 13. Their ages are important because they place the tragedy in its proper human context. These were not distant figures whose lives can be reduced to 4 names in a case summary. They were teenagers spending a Saturday evening together, and the plans they had for that night were ordinary. They had a fire, a guitar, conversation, and marijuana. Whatever decisions they had made about how to spend their evening, none of them could have anticipated the violence that followed. The first part of the tragedy was therefore its unpredictability. The teenagers had gone to a relatively isolated place, but they had no reason to expect that 3 armed men would appear and confront them. The Fryer brothers were in the area illegally hunting deer. After discovering the teenagers and becoming aware that they possessed marijuana, the brothers decided to take it. From there, the encounter escalated rapidly. The men approached with firearms and represented themselves as narcotics officers. That false identity became an important part of the encounter because it allowed the men to present themselves as people with authority. The teenagers were young and isolated, while the men had guns. The imbalance between the 2 groups was profound. Once the first shots were fired, the evening could no longer return to what it had been. Roger Essam was killed. Stuart Botta and Michael Hadrath were wounded. Sandra, Dana, and Michael attempted to hide. The attackers continued to control the situation. Eventually, Alan Fryer left the area with Sandra, while David and James remained behind. Stuart, Dana, and Michael were killed. The sequence matters because it shows that the deaths were not the result of one isolated instant. The violence continued after the initial confrontation. There were multiple opportunities for the situation to end without further deaths, but those opportunities were not taken. The case therefore illustrates the devastating consequences of escalation. What may have begun as an attempt to obtain marijuana became a crime involving 4 deaths, and the abduction and sexual assault of a 13-year-old survivor. Sandra's experience formed a separate but connected part of the tragedy. After being taken away from the others, she was brought to an abandoned farm near Hartford, South Dakota. There, according to her testimony, James Fryer sexually assaulted her. She was eventually taken home and released at approximately 5 in the morning. She had survived, but she returned to a world in which 4 of the people who had been with her earlier that night were dead. The investigation that followed depended heavily on her ability to remember. At first, that ability was questioned. Some investigators were skeptical of her account, including because of her age and demeanor. Yet she continued to provide information. She underwent repeated questioning and, according to the case information, passed a polygraph examination. More importantly, her account contained details that could be tested. She described the abandoned farm and remembered a large red fuel tank. Sheriff Craig Vinson believed her and continued looking for the location. On November 29, 1973, he took Sandra into the rural area around Hartford. They passed a number of properties. Then Sandra recognized the red fuel tank. The location matched the place she had described. The farm was connected to Alan Fryer through his employment. Soon afterward, Sandra saw Alan driving a brown pickup truck. She recognized him and identified him to Vinson. Her statement, "That's him, that's the boss," became the moment when memory and investigation came together. The identification led to Alan's arrest, followed by the arrests of David and James. The investigation demonstrates the value of preserving a witness's account even when that witness is young and traumatized. Sandra could not provide every answer. She could not tell investigators everything about what happened after she left the scene, but she could describe what she personally experienced. She remembered the men, the vehicle, the farm, and the distinctive fuel tank. Those details provided investigators with a route from the crime scene to the suspects. The case also left an important legal record because the brothers did not receive identical convictions. David Fryer pleaded guilty and was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Stuart Botta. He received life imprisonment without parole. Alan Fryer was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and received 4 consecutive life sentences. James Fryer was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. He received 3 life sentences and an additional sentence for manslaughter. These differences should remain part of any accurate account of the case. The 3 brothers were prosecuted separately, and the legal system made separate findings about their responsibility. Their later actions also became part of the history of the case. Alan and James escaped from the Lyon County Jail in June 1974. They stole a vehicle and fled Iowa. 2 days later, the vehicle was connected with a hit-and-run near Gillette, Wyoming. The 2 were captured and returned to custody. Alan later continued challenging his conviction. In 1985, a federal appellate court rejected his challenge and upheld the conviction. These later developments demonstrate that the case did not simply disappear after the original trials. Its legal history continued through appeals and post-conviction proceedings. But the most enduring consequences were experienced by people who were not defendants. The families of Roger, Stuart, Dana, and Michael had to live with the loss of young lives. Sandra had to live with the fact that she had survived when her 4 friends had not. The courtroom could assign responsibility, but it could not erase those losses. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to make the conclusion of a case feel like a neat ending. Arrests happen, trials occur, convictions are announced, and sentences are imposed. But real cases rarely provide that kind of emotional closure. The legal system can answer specific questions. Who was charged? What evidence was presented? What verdict was reached? What sentence was imposed? The Gitche-Manitou case provides clear answers to those questions. Yet the emotional consequences remain more complicated. The victims were still gone. Sandra still carried the memory of the night. Their families still had to continue living after the case entered the historical record. That distinction is essential when telling the story responsibly. The focus should not remain on the notoriety of the perpetrators. The Fryer brothers became known because of what they did, but the lives that deserve to remain at the center of the story are those of the people whose lives were taken. Roger, Stuart, Dana, and Michael should not be remembered only as victims in a crime narrative. Their names identify 4 young people who were alive on the evening of November 17, 1973. They had friends, they had families, they had futures. The available information does not provide every detail of their individual lives. And it is better not to invent what is unknown. What can be said with certainty is that they were together that night and that they did not return home. Sandra's role in preserving their story is equally important. She did not choose to become a witness. She did not choose to become the person who would identify one of the suspects. She survived because the events ended differently for her than they did for the other 4. Yet her survival helped ensure that the investigation did not remain a mystery. The red fuel tank, the abandoned farm, the brown pickup truck, and her recognition of Alan Fryer created a chain of evidence that investigators could follow. In that sense, her memory became part of the path toward justice for the 4 who could no longer speak. The Gitche Manitou murders also leave a broader warning about the danger of false authority. The attackers' claim that they were law enforcement officers was not merely a detail of the story. It was a method of control. The teenagers were confronted by adults with guns who presented themselves as people with legal authority. The deception made it harder for the victims to understand what was actually happening. It is one of the reasons the case remains so disturbing. The people who appeared to have authority were, in reality, the source of the danger. Ultimately, however, the story returns to the same place where it began. 5 teenagers spending an evening together. There is no need to embellish that beginning because the reality is powerful enough. Roger Essam, Stuart Bada, Dana Bada, Michael Hadrath, and Sandra Chesky went to Gitche Manitou on November 17, 1973. 4 died. 1 survived. The investigation that followed relied upon that survivor's memory. The courts eventually established the responsibility of Alan, David, and James Fryer. The convictions survived later legal challenges. But justice did not mean that the tragedy was undone. The 4 teenagers remained dead, and Sandra remained the survivor of an experience that had changed her life. That is the lasting meaning of the case. It is not simply a story about 3 convicted men. It is the story of 4 young people whose futures were taken away. 1 young survivor whose testimony helped reveal what happened, and an investigation that transformed fragments of memory into evidence. Decades later, the legal record can tell us how the case ended in court. But the human ending is more difficult. There is no courtroom verdict capable of restoring a life. There is no sentence capable of returning a friend to the people who loved him. There is only the record, the names, and the responsibility to remember the victims as people rather than statistics. In the history of Gitche Manitou, those names remain the most important part of the story. Roger Essam, 17, Stuart Bada, 18, Dana Bada, 14, Michael Hadrath, 15. And beside their names is Sandra Chesky, 13, the survivor whose memory helped bring the truth of that night into the light.